Human Becoming, a Deductive Reconstruction.
Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're inviting you to ponder something truly vast. When we think of memory, our brains usually come to mind, right?
Yeah, that's the default.
But what if memory is far more fundamental, woven into the very fabric of existence, from the smallest molecule all the way up to the largest civilization?
It's a huge question.
Get ready, because we're embarking on a truly ambitious deep dive today. We're centering it around a groundbreaking new paper by Eric Hutton and Ralph Buchwitz. It's titled Human Becoming, a Deductive Reconstruction of Emergence in the Human Timeline.
And this paper, as you'll soon discover, it isn't really interested in easy answers. Not at all.
Yeah.
Instead, it meticulously builds this really rigorous model of human identity and memory from what they call first principles. It's a fascinating integration of insights. They're pulling from fields as diverse as physics, chemistry, biology, cognition, culture, even symbolic recurrence.
Wow, that's broad.
It really is. The authors emphasize observable phenomena, logical deduction, and how everything, from our individual cells to our grandest societies, is profoundly shaped by recursion, memory, collapse, and return. It offers a truly holistic, sort of interconnected view of what it means to remember.
Absolutely. So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack the incredible implications of this paper and its supporting sources. We want to reveal how memory isn't just a function of our minds like we traditionally think.
Right. It's much bigger than that.
It's a foundational force operating in, surprising ways throughout our bodies, our societies, even the technologies we create. Prepare yourself for some serious aha moments that might fundamentally shift how you think about the very act of remembering.
Yeah, could change things.
Let's unpack this, starting from the very, very beginning. The deep roots of memory. So part one, the deep roots of memory, from chemistry to our cells. Okay, so when we talk about memory, like I said, our brains are usually the first thing that comes to mind. But what if memory actually begins long before neurons even enter the picture?
That's the really radical idea Hutton and Buchwitz put forward right off the bat.
Yeah.
They argue that chemistry itself holds memory. And this isn't just, a poetic metaphor. They deduce it from observable phenomena.
Chemistry itself, how does that even work?
Well, that's the truly mind-bending insight here. Memory might literally begin at the atomic and molecular level. Imagine chemistry itself having a kind of memory, not a brain, obviously, but an inherent ability to remember patterns that work.
Okay.
Prebiotic experiments, these are essentially attempts to recreate conditions on early Earth to see how life might have first emerged. They show us how. It's like certain chemical reactions learn to repeat themselves. They create what Hutton and Buchwitz call feedback chemistry.
So these reactions are, in a sense, self-reinforcing. Like they remember a successful recipe and just keep making it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Exactly. They produce more of the very things that caused them to happen in the first place. The Foremost reaction, for example, is a stunning illustration where simple sugar chains can actually self-replicate.
Just on their own.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Or consider Marlinite clay. It's not alive, right? But it can catalyze the formation of RNA polymers, which are crucial precursors to life.
Wow.
And then there are lipid vesicles, these tiny sacs of fat that can encapsulate reactions, forming rudimentary boundaries. So the paper deduces that life isn't about some pre-programmed instruction set, not initially anyway. It's about these recursive reactions and boundaries, a dynamic interplay of processes that, in a sense, remember what worked, allowing for continuation and eventually evolution.
It's like the system keeps a ledger, a chemical ledger of successful interactions.
That's a good way to put it. A chemical ledger.
That's a fascinating reframing. So if it's not a pre-programmed instruction set, what does that imply about the very nature of these early, proto-life forms? Were they essentially learning machines from the very start, even without a brain?
In a way, yes. Learning is maybe a strong word, but they are self-organizing based on feedback. Hutton and Buchwitz highlight foundational concepts like Stuart Kauffman's autocatalytic sets. These are groups of molecules that collectively catalyze each other's formation, leading to self-sustaining networks.
Okay.
Or Günter Vectorshäuser's surface catalysis theory, where reactions occur on mineral surfaces, providing a kind of fixed location for complex chemistry to develop. Protocell theories also model how chemistry can form self-organizing feedback loops even before what we typically think of as information or genetic code comes into play.
So it's a fundamental chemical memory of successful outcomes.
Exactly, laying the groundwork for all the future biological complexity we see.
That's a mind-bending start. And it leads right into our next point, doesn't it? This idea that our DNA itself is a living, evolving record. Jason Finley's work on expanded taxonomies of human memory really pushes this broader view, arguing memory exists way beyond just the brain.
Absolutely. Finley's work is crucial here. And Hutton and Buchwitz pick up on this, expanding on how our very own DNA fits this picture. They suggest DNA isn't just a blueprint, which is the common metaphor.
Right, like instructions.
Yeah, but they see it differently. They see it as a historical memory, an iterative archive of remembered survivals.
Remembered survivals. I like that.
It's evocative, isn't it? It's not a forward-planning instruction manual. It's more like a record of what has worked in the past for that lineage. They point out that most DNA is actually regulatory, not coding for proteins.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, which supports the idea that it primarily stores outcomes, or perhaps the rules for reacting, rather than detailed plans. Evolution, in their view, is the process that filters experience by fitness, and DNA becomes its ledger.
The ledger again. So it's a living, breathing record of successful adaptation passed down through generations. And this concept of DNA as historical memory ties perfectly into epigenetics, doesn't it? This field that Dr. Lerner and Dr. Yehuda delve into, showing how our experiences can leave a physical mark on our genes.
Yes, epigenetics is a prime example of this biological memory in action. It refers to inheritable changes in gene expression. That's the key part that occur without actually altering the underlying DNA sequence itself.
Okay, so the code stays the same, but how it's read changes.
Exactly. Imagine your DNA as a book. Epigenetics doesn't change the words on the pages, but it can change which pages are highlighted, maybe which are dog-eared, or even which chapters are readily accessible at any given time.
Right.
This means that experiences, particularly significant stress, can directly influence how our genes behave. And crucially, these influences can sometimes even be passed down to future generations.
So what does this all mean for us? Can you give us some real-world impacts? Because this sounds incredibly profound.
It truly is. For example, studies have shown that infants exposed to significant maternal stress during fetal development can have changes in how certain stress response genes are marked, epigenetically marked. This influences how those genes are expressed later on.
So the mother's experience directly affects the baby's gene expression.
It appears so. This has been observed in various contexts, including war-related psychosocial stressors and maternal exposure to partner violence during pregnancy. Even years later, these epigenetic marks can still be detected in some cases.
Wow, so the stress a mother experiences can literally leave a mark on her child's DNA expression. Potentially. That's powerful.
Absolutely. And it's not just prenatal stress. In studies of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, similar epigenetic changes have been detected in genes related to stress response and immune function. You see this in war veterans, police officers with a history of trauma.
So it's tangible, a molecular memory of trauma.
It seems to be, yes. These are tangible ways that severe experiences are remembered at a molecular level, influencing how our bodies react and adapt going forward.
That's a lot to process, but...
I imagine there are challenges in researching this. Human experience is so complex.
Oh, definitely. There are significant complexities and limitations. One major challenge is just untangling the effects of multiple stressors. When you're investigating the epigenetic effects of psychosocial factors, people are often exposed to various types of stress simultaneously, right? So isolating the precise impact of one specific thing is really difficult.
Right.
Plus, researchers face issues of tissue specificity. Epigenetic changes can vary across different tissues in the body, even between different cell types within a tissue. So findings from, say, blood cells might not directly translate to what's happening in the brain.
So it's tricky to get the full picture.
Very tricky. Overcoming these hurdles will require, well, sustained long-term studies and, crucially, interdisciplinary collaboration. You need sociologists, biologists, epidemiologists all working together to truly understand the full scope of these epigenetic memories. So our DNA isn't just a static blueprint. It's this dynamic historical archive. It can be updated by life experiences, potentially even inherited. Okay, but let's move on to another incredible biological system that, according to Finley, is a robust memory system in itself. The immune system.
Indeed, the immune system is a fantastic example. It's like a vigilant memory keeper, constantly learning and adapting. Think about how it works. When your body encounters a new pathogen, a new germ, for the first time, it mounts what's called a primary immune response.
Okay, the first fight.
Right. And this takes time, usually a week or more, as the system learns to identify and fight the invader. But if you encounter that same pathogen again later, a secondary response kicks in.
That one's faster.
Much faster, much stronger, and produces a far greater abundance of antibodies. This rapid and potent response is mediated by specialized cells. Memory, T and B white blood cells. They literally remember the previous encounter.
So they have a memory.
They do. It allows for a swift and effective defense. Even other immune cells, like natural killer cells, can demonstrate a type of memory, learning to better distinguish between healthy and unhealthy cells over time.
That sounds a lot like our brain's memory, learning and responding based on past experience. And it has some pretty amazing real-world applications, especially in medicine, right?
Absolutely. This understanding of immunological memory is foundational to the groundbreaking field of immunotherapy for cancer. It's really transformed treatment for some cancers.
How does that work exactly?
Well, take CODA-way T-cell therapy. It involves taking a patient's own immune cells, their T cells, and genetically reprogramming them in the lab. You basically teach them to specifically recognize and attack the patient's tumor cells.
You engineer them.
Exactly. Then these re-engineered cells are infused back into the patient. It essentially gives their immune system a highly specialized, lasting memory of the cancer.
So it's training the body's own defense system to remember and target cancer. Are there other examples, like vaccines?
Yes. Cancer vaccines are another exciting area. They're designed to train the immune system to recognize components of tumor cells, priming it for attack. And the results can be quite striking. For instance, one study found that melanoma survivors who had undergone immunotherapy maintained these memory T cells, specifically calibrated against their cancer, for up to 9 years after treatment.
9 years! That's incredible long-term memory.
It really is a clear demonstration of long-term immunological memory at work, preventing cancer recurrence in those patients.
That's truly incredible. It sounds like immunological memory has parallels to neurological memory, but also some key differences, I guess.
It does. You can draw parallels, for instance, by looking at autoimmune diseases. In those conditions, the immune system mistakenly recognizes healthy tissue as a pathogen and attacks it.
Yeah.
It's somewhat analogous to false memory in the neurological sense, where the brain misremembers or misidentifies something. And like neurological memory, immunological memory has dimensions, things like strength, duration, speed, specificity. Both also appear to undergo some form of system consolidation during sleep, which suggests maybe a common biological principle for memory formation.
But it's not unlimited, right? Like our brain seems to store endless memories, but the immune system...
That's a key difference, yeah.
Yeah.
Unlike the brain's seemingly vast capacity, long-term immunological memory appears to have a limited capacity. There's probably a maximum number of memory cells that can be maintained effectively.
Okay.
So this makes interference an important consideration. There might be competition among memory cells if you encounter too many different pathogens or get too many different vaccines close together, for instance.
That makes sense. Now, it's fascinating how memory can be passed down epigenetically. Is there an intergenerational transfer of immune memory as well?
Yes, this is another profound aspect.
Yeah.
Before birth, antibodies are transferred from the mother's bloodstream to the fetus directly through the placenta.
Right.
These antibodies exist because the mother's immune system previously encountered and responded to various antigens, or perhaps she was vaccinated. So maternal immunity provides passive protection against common pathogens for the fetus and newborn.
So the baby gets a temporary shield.
Exactly. This transferred immunological memory isn't permanent. The maternal antibodies decay over months, which is why infant vaccinations are timed the way they are. But it's a crucial, borrowed immunological memory for newborn survival until their own adaptive immunity develops properly.
So it's a kind of inherited head start for the immune system. And what about the very act of birth itself? Does that play a role in this memory transfer?
Indeed it does. During a vaginal birth, newborns are exposed to maternal bacteria, which helps to seed their own intestinal microbiota, their gut bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
This early microbial seeding plays a really crucial role in boosting the infant's immune system development. Infants delivered by C-section, who don't have this same exposure, often have less diverse gut microbiota initially, and may have a slightly higher risk of certain immune-related issues later on.
And breastfeeding, too.
Yes, breast milk also seeds the infant gut microbiome with maternal bacteria, and, crucially, contains maternal antibodies that continue to train the infant's immune system. Finley describes this whole process, the seeding of the microbiome, as an interesting case of a form of long-term memory directly from mother to child, in the form of beneficial bacteria.
Wow.
Some researchers even argue for the concept of the hologenome, the idea that the total DNA of a human and all its symbiotic microorganisms acts as a single unit responding to the environment, a kind of genetic vehicle for collective memory across species.
Okay, so we're seeing memory at the chemical level in our DNA via epigenetics in our immune system. But Finley's expanded taxonomy goes even further. He shows how information from the past can be stored and retrieved from various other parts of the human body. And he's careful to distinguish this from that pseudoscientific concept of body memory that's often talked about.
Right, that's an important distinction. Finley isn't talking about traumatic memories being literally stored in muscles, which lacks scientific evidence. He's focused on verifiable ways the body records past information. He introduces these fascinating categories.
Like what?
Well, think of episodic memory as remembering a specific, unique event, like the scar you got from falling off your bike as a kid. That's a physical record of a single episode.
Okay, makes sense.
Then there's semantic memory, which is like general, unchanging knowledge stored in the body. Your unique fingerprints, for instance. They're formed before birth and don't change. They're a kind of semantic fact about you, physically encoded.
Right.
And then rhipisodic memory. This is about repeated experiences, like the calluses on a guitarist's fingertips. That's a physical record of countless hours of repeated practice, a memory of many similar episodes.
So our skin literally wears our history in different ways. Scars, calluses, fingerprints. What about something like hair?
Hair, too, records information. If your hair has a color other than its natural shade, well, that's a record of recent dyeing or bleaching, right?
Uh-huh.
The length of the new growth at the roots tells you precisely how long it's been since the last treatment. It's a timeline.
A very visible timeline.
Exactly. And hair carries profound cultural meaning, too, acting as a form of collective memory. Think about the historical significance of hair in the Black community.
Yeah.
During slavery, intricate hair care was often forbidden as an act of dehumanization. Yet enslaved African Americans developed styles like braids and cornrows, partly as a form of cultural resilience and even communication. Later, during the Civil Rights Movement, natural styles like the afro became powerful expressions of pride and defiance against assimilationist pressures.
And that continues today.
Absolutely. Things like the Crown Act, passed in the U.S. recently, aim to protect against workplace discrimination based on these natural hairstyles. It shows that Black hair continues to be a vital part of the community's culture and collective memory.
That's powerful.
And similarly, for many Native American people, forced assimilation at boarding schools historically included cutting children's long hair, highlighting how deeply hair can be connected to cultural identity and collective memory, and how traumatic its loss can be.
That's a really potent example of how physical attributes intertwine with history and identity. What about deliberate body alterations? Like tattoos. Those seem explicitly about memory sometimes.
They often are. Body modifications like tattoos are a very durable form of memory, often created specifically for memory purposes. A German study found that most tattoos people got were inspired by unique life events, things like personal growth, important relationships, leisure activities, commemorating losses, or even marking recovery from diseases.
So they embody memory.
Exactly. Tattoos literally allow for the physical embodiment of autobiographical memories, helping people reflect on their life story. A tattooed body can literally tell a story, piece by piece.
Of course, sometimes people regret them.
Right? And they can become regrettable reminders, which is where tattoo removal or getting a cover-up becomes a form of intentional forgetting, erasing that physical memory trace.
And do tattoos also function as markers of group identity, like Shere Khan?
Yes, profoundly so in many cultures. For the Maori people of New Zealand, traditional tamoko tattoos are a deep sign of cultural identity and can indicate social rank and genealogy. There are even cases where descendants of Holocaust survivors have chosen to replicate the concentration camp number tattoos of their relatives as a memorial practice, a very heavy form of remembrance.
Wow.
And you see it in other groups too, prison or gang tattoos conveying meanings about affiliation or time served. The Yakuza in Japan use extensive body tattooing as a mark of loyalty, which has in turn led to a broader cultural stigma against tattoos in Japanese society. These are all clear examples of how body modifications serve as a durable, visible marker of individual and collective memory.
Okay, so beyond the surface, what about our muscles? We talk about muscle memory, but is there more to it biologically?
There is, yes. Muscles exhibit something called savings in relearning. When you exercise, muscle cells get tiny tears, and upon repair, they gain extra nuclei. Now, crucially, these extra nuclei tend to remain in the muscle fibers even during prolonged inactivity.
Oh, really? They stick around.
They seem to. This means if someone builds muscle, stops training for a while, and then resumes, they can often regain that muscle mass much faster than it took to build it the first time. The muscles sort of remember that past state of being trained.
That's a fascinating biological mechanism for memory. What about how we move in general? Our posture, our walk?
Our gait, our unique walking pattern definitely reflects our history. It can show signs of past or present disease, injury, or simply aging. Gait analysis is a valuable clinical tool for this reason. Our posture, too, the way our body parts relate to each other, carries information influenced by lifestyle, occupation, past injuries.
You can tell a lot from how someone carries themselves.
You can. Even idiosyncratic mannerisms, little habits of movement or body language, reflect our personal movement history. And think about dance styles transmitted across generations, often orally or through demonstration. That's a profound form of collective memory, fostering social ties, preserving cultural identity, and serving as an integral part of oral tradition in many cultures. The specific muscle strengths and movement patterns acquired through dance reflect a history of movement that is absolutely a form of procedural memory in the body itself.
Language, of course, is absolutely essential to the human experience. Finley calls it the bedrock of collective memory. How does our voice itself reflect this memory?
Well, our voice is the key to spoken language, right? And the language we speak is a direct function of what we've learned and where we've been. Our native language, acquired in infancy, or any additional languages learned later, these are a direct record of our linguistic experience. Accents, exactly. Regional accents and dialects clearly indicate where one has lived or grown up. The pitch of our voice can signify developmental stages, like deepening during puberty due to hormones. Even temporary hoarseness can signal recent overuse, maybe sickness or smoking habits. It all carries information about the recent or distant past.
It's remarkable how many subtle forms of memory exist throughout the body. What about our reproductive systems? That seems like maybe an unexpected place to find memory.
It is, but there are examples. Beyond the obvious secondary sexual characteristics that indicate hormonal history, the female reproductive system shows subtle forms of memory. Fertility, for instance, changes predictably with age, but it also demonstrates a kind of priming.
Priming? How so?
Well, for subsequent birth after the first one, the duration of labor tends to be shorter, on average. It's almost as if the body remembers the process and becomes more efficient at it.
Ah, interesting.
Even more intriguingly, the risk of preeclampsia, a condition involving high blood pressure during pregnancy, often decreases in additional pregnancies with the same father.
Really? Why?
The thinking is it might be due to the mother's immunological memory, becoming more tolerant to antigens from the father, which are present in the fetus, after the first exposure.
Ah, connecting back to immune memory.
Exactly. There's even some evidence that a mother's body can retain fetal cells from pregnancy, possibly for decades, which might have long-term health implications, both good and bad. These cells carry the memory of that pregnancy. And even the menstrual cycle itself, with its approximately monthly rhythm, can be seen as a kind of internal biological memory system, reflecting the body's cyclical programming.
Okay, one more from Finley's list.
Yeah.
What about something as seemingly inert as fat? Does that store memory?
Absolutely. Fat cells, or adipose tissue, are essentially a long-term memory system for excess calories. When we consume more calories than we need, they get stored or encoded in fat tissue throughout the body. This becomes a reservoir of energy, a clear memory of past consumption relative to expenditure.
And retrieval is using that energy.
Right. When energy requirements exceed current intake, the body retrieves this memory by releasing triglycerides, fatty acids, from the fat cells back into the bloodstream to be used as fuel. What's fascinating is that the storage capacity of this system is practically unlimited. The body can always create more and larger fat cells if needed.
So our fat is a record.
It's a record of your energy balance history. And significantly, fat cells can also store certain fat-soluble chemicals or drugs for long periods, creating a lasting chemical memory of past exposures as well.
That's a truly comprehensive view of memory within the individual body. Just amazing. But Finley also touches on how different cultures use the body itself as a memory system, specifically with numerical representation, like counting. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, this is a great example of how culture shapes embodied memory. While finger counting is pretty much a universal method to offload working memory, the exact strategies vary dramatically across cultures. Well, researchers have reviewed this diversity. Many Western European systems tend to start counting on the left hand, often beginning with the thumb or index finger. In contrast, the traditional Iranian system starts with the right hand's pinky finger.
Okay, different starting points.
But it gets much more complex. The Oxatman people in Papua New Guinea, for instance, use a counting system that incorporates 27 distinct points across the upper body, including wrists, elbows, shoulders, neck, head, ears.
27 body points for counting. That's incredible.
It really highlights the diversity.
Mm.
And it connects to how different cultures employ different number bases, too, like cranary using one hand, base 5, decimal using two hands, base 10, or even vigesimal using fingers and toes, base 20.
Right.
These systems illustrate fascinating trade-offs between memory representations stored purely in the brain versus those physically embodied or mapped onto the body. It shows how our shared physical form is leveraged in culturally unique ways to manage and externalize cognitive processes like counting and remembering quantities. Collective memory, shaping our shared past and present.
Okay, so we've journeyed through memory at the chemical, cellular, and individual bodily levels. Now let's zoom out to collective memory. Hutt and Buchwitz argue this is essentially an externalized form of memory. They propose that culture truly begins when behavior becomes repeatable memory moved from genome to gesture.
Yes, their framework here is quite powerful. They look at the archaeological record. Homo naledi, an early human relative, was burying their dead, possibly as far back as 300,000 years ago. The deliberate use of ochre, making beads, controlling fire, these things date back over 100,000 years. Symbolic tools appear even before agriculture really takes off.
So what do they deduce from that?
They deduce that burial, for instance, isn't just about getting rid of a body. It's about encoding return. Maybe a cyclical understanding of life and death, creating a fixed point of remembrance. Fire, while practical for cooking and warmth, also becomes ritualistic, a focal point for the community, a shared memory. Culture, in their view, is where behavior stops being just instinct or genetic programming and becomes a repeatable memory that moves into shared gestures, practices, stories, and material objects that hold meaning for the group.
The grave becomes an anchor, fire guardian, culture, and externalized memory.
Exactly, those kinds of symbolic interpretations.
And Finley, coming from a more psychological angle, defines collective memory as the shared memories of a group's history that are fundamental to their identity. But this isn't just in people's individual minds, is it? It's distributed much more broadly.
It is indeed. Collective memory isn't located in one place. It's distributed across the minds of individuals within a social group, sure, but also crucially through their shared narratives, oral stories, written histories, folklore. It's embedded in their physical environment, architecture, monuments, memorials.
And practices.
Yes, and practices. Rituals, festivals, holidays, traditions, songs, even public symbols and material culture. All these things carry and transmit collective memory.
And what does this collective memory do for the group?
It serves several really crucial functions. It helps create and maintain group identity, that sense of I-us. It provides narrative structures or schemas that help people interpret past and current events through a shared lens. And it guides the group's future, often by trying to learn from or commemorate past experiences, like aiming to avoid past mistakes or celebrate past triumphs.
It allows future generations to understand.
Exactly. As some scholars put it, many cultural practices function to transmit historical knowledge and experience across generations, to allow future generations to understand the world and to respond adaptively. It's a functional inheritance of knowledge.
That's a great transition to oral tradition, which Hutton and Buchwitz highlight as incredibly significant, especially given how long humans existed before writing. They note that despite writing only being around for, 5,000 years or so?
Roughly, yeah.
Oral cultures preserved high-fidelity traditions for millennia before that. They even deduce that language itself is a powerful compression system that preserves memory rather than merely expressing thoughts, and that story itself is an execution of that memory.
This is a profound insight into human communication, especially pre-literate communication. Oral tradition is basically testimony transmitted, verbally spoken, sung, chanted, maybe even conveyed through musical instruments across at least one generation, usually many more.
And it can be surprisingly accurate, right? Not just myth.
That's what's truly remarkable. Its potential for stable longevity and accuracy. Researchers who study oral tradition find that its stability is often facilitated by the careful organization of meaning. Things like using familiar scripts or story grammars, clear causal chains.
Structure helps memory.
Absolutely. Spatial and visual imagery within the stories play a key role too, as do patterns of sound, think rhyme, alliteration, rhythm, music. Highly structured language, like that seen in ancient epic poetry or religious texts, tends to undergo fewer alterations during transmission. It was believed, for instance, that the rigid structure of classical Arabic poetry made it a more reliable medium for preservation.
So these aren't just random campfire stories. They're often intricately designed to be remembered accurately. Do we have compelling examples of this longevity, like really long term?
We do, and they are genuinely captivating. Australian Aboriginal groups, for example, have passed down stories detailing specific coastline changes, sea level rise after the last ice age, that have remained accurate for over 7,000 years.
7,000 years. How do we know they're accurate?
Because modern geographical and geological data corroborates the descriptions in the stories. It matches the timeline of sea level changes in those specific locations. It's astonishing.
That is astonishing.
Another example often cited is a tale from the Klamath Native American tribe in Oregon, which seems to recall the massive volcanic eruption that formed Crater Lake, an event dated to about 7,700 years ago.
Wow. How did they maintain that accuracy for so long?
It's often attributed to a combination of factors. The role of specialized story keepers within the community, people whose job it was to memorize and transmit traditions accurately. Also, relative cultural isolation sometimes helped minimize external influences or changes to the stories.
And Native American storytelling itself has a particular style, doesn't it? More than just recounting facts.
Yes, it's often described as a collaborative, dynamic experience between the storyteller and the listeners. It frequently fuses fictional or supernatural elements with real human emotions and moral lessons, designed to teach practical wisdom derived from tribal experience. There's often a fluidity in the delivery, allowing skilled storytellers to draw on their personal memory and the collective memory of the group, adapting the stories subtly to fit different social circumstances or audiences while keeping the core intact.
So it's alive, not just recited.
Very much so. And even in more formalized traditions, you see structures designed for memory. Think of formulaic composition, the repeated phrases, epithets, and metrical patterns found in ancient epics, like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, or in religious texts like the Vedas or the Quran. These structures clearly aided memorization and oral transmission across generations before widespread literacy.
It makes you wonder how much was gained, but also perhaps how much was lost or changed when writing became the dominant form of preserving and sharing information.
It's an important consideration. The invention of written language, and especially later the printing press around 1440 CE, undeniably revolutionized things. It dramatically broadened the reach of information, helped standardize knowledge, and certainly catalyzed the scientific revolution by allowing easier sharing and building upon previous work. Libraries and archives proliferated, becoming these huge repositories of collective memory. But there's often been a historical Western bias, viewing oral tradition as somehow inherently unreliable or inferior to written records. This overlooks the incredible fidelity that can be achieved through oral transmission and the sophisticated mnemonic techniques developed within those cultures. As one scholar memorably put it, historians dealing with oral tradition will have to unlearn this prejudice in order to rediscover the full wonder of words.
That's a powerful point. But even with written history, collective memory isn't static, is it? Finley points out that different groups can remember the same events very differently. You mentioned rival football fans.
Right, the classic example. Or how different nations remember events like World War II based on their own experiences and narratives. This malleability of individual memory, how we reconstruct rather than replay the past, enables these differing collective memories to emerge and evolve.
Which allows for what some call contested memory.
Exactly. Historical narratives aren't fixed. They evolve, they get debated, they get reshaped. Barry Schwartz's work on Abraham Lincoln's shifting image in American collective memory provides a fantastic case study of this.
How so? What did he find?
Well, Schwartz argues that collective memory isn't just one thing. It's realized in the distribution of beliefs about the past within a population. And these beliefs are shaped by two main forces. Historical narratives, what's taught in schools, written textbooks, shown in movies and TV, and commemorative symbolism, things like monuments, holidays, rituals, statues.
Okay, so Lincoln's image isn't just a fixed historical fact, but something continuously reshaped by how Americans choose to remember him through these channels.
Precisely. Schwartz identifies what he calls 5 Lincolns that have coexisted or competed in American collective memory. Lincoln is the savior of the Union. Lincoln is the great emancipator. Lincoln is the man of the people. Lincoln is the quintessential first American, and Lincoln as the self-made man.
5 Lincolns.
Wow. And what's truly illuminating is the dramatic transformation he documents over time. He compares, for instance, a Gallup survey from 1945, right in the middle of World War II, where preserving the nation was paramount. In that survey, Americans overwhelmingly remembered Lincoln first and foremost as the savior of the Union. His emancipation efforts were largely framed, even by Lincoln himself at times, as a strategic means to achieve that Union victory.
Right, moving first.
But then, fast forward to the 2001 National Employee Survey Schwartz analyzed. By then, the dominant image had shifted dramatically. Great emancipator had become the primary way Lincoln was remembered. People placed much greater importance on his imagined commitment to civil rights, often even more strongly than contemporary textbooks or historical accounts might strictly warrant.
So public belief and current values were actively reshaping the collective memory of Lincoln.
Absolutely. It clearly illustrates how collective memory isn't just passively received history. It's an active process where present-day concerns, values, and beliefs constantly interact with and reinterpret the past. Sometimes this moves collective understanding beyond what even the historical texts emphasized at an earlier time.
That's a stark example of how historical narratives are dynamic. But what happens when narratives are not just reinterpreted, but actively erased or suppressed? How does that impact individuals, particularly, say, in technical fields like software engineering?
This brings us to a really important connection made by Trenkenreich and colleagues, linking contested or erased collective memory directly to the experience of the imposter phenomenon, or IP.
Imposter phenomenon, that feeling of being a fraud, even when you're successful.
Exactly that feeling. And Trenkenreich et al. Show how false narratives and, crucially, erasures from computing history can actively reinforce harmful stereotypes and contribute to increased rates of imposter phenomenon, particularly among underrepresented groups.
Can you give an example?
Yes, a critical example they cite, which has gained more attention recently thanks to books and movies like Hidden Figures, is the overlooked contributions of Black women who worked as human computers and programmed early mainframes for NASA and the U.S. military.
Their contributions were essentially forgotten or minimized in the standard history of computing for a long time.
That's right. They were erased from the dominant narrative. And this erasure isn't benign. It propagates false narratives, like the damaging stereotypes that Black women lack interest or aptitude in computer science. Or the flip side, that white men just naturally excel at programming. These incomplete or biased historical accounts then directly contribute to women, especially Black women, experiencing higher rates of imposter phenomenon in the field today.
So this isn't just an individual psychological issue. It's being actively exacerbated by systemic problems rooted in how collective memory is shaped and whose stories get told.
That's the crucial connection they make. The research indicates that IP is more prevalent among women in software engineering, particularly Black women, single women, and childless women in their studies. It's a tangible, measurable example of how a distorted or incomplete societal collective memory, a flawed historical narrative, can create real systemic issues that directly harm individual well-being, fuel self-doubt, anxiety, depression, burnout, and perpetuate inequalities within a field like tech.
Wow.
It really underscores that addressing representation, telling fuller histories, and ensuring inclusion are not just matters of abstract fairness. They are critical, practical steps needed to mitigate imposter phenomenon and foster a healthier, more equitable environment where everyone feels they belong and can succeed. It shows how the past, or rather, how we remember the past, can actively harm or help people in the present. 3. Memory and systems. Collapse, AI, and empirical standards.
We've covered memory from chemistry all the way to human culture, and its sometimes damaging distortions. Now, let's broaden our scope even further for this last section and consider how memory operates in really large-scale systems, starting with civilizations themselves. Hutton and Buchwitz make a truly provocative claim here. They observe that all known civilizations rise and collapse in patterns, and they propose that collapse itself encodes memory.
Yeah, this is a radical reinterpretation of collapse. They argue it's not merely failure in the traditional sense, not just everything falling apart randomly.
Yeah.
They see it as more of a pattern reset.
A reset.
Yes, where what collapses is primarily function rather than form.
Yes.
Maybe the complex political structure fails, but underlying technologies, social patterns, or even myths might persist. The concept they use is reboot follows loss, suggesting a structural recurrence of cyclical nature to these large-scale societal dynamics.
So collapse isn't an end, but part of a cycle that carries information forward.
That's the idea. And they use powerful symbolic language to illustrate how memory persists, even through societal dissolution. The flood myth, found in many cultures, becomes a metaphor for a data wipe. The temple, often preserved or rebuilt, acts like a backup drive, holding essential cultural information. And the survivor, the one who carries the story or the skills, is the pattern seed for the next iteration.
Flood as data wipe, temple as backup drive, survivor as pattern seed. That's quite a framing.
It implies that even in apparent destruction and loss, certain essential patterns, information, or memories are retained and passed forward, allowing for new beginnings, often building on the remnants of the old.
That's a fascinating way to frame societal collapse, not as just an end, but as a mechanism for memory transmission and maybe even renewal. Now, shifting gears slightly, but staying with systems, Hutton and Buchwitz also offer a very new lens on science itself. They view science as a kind of memory tool, and provocatively they suggest that AI core access functions as memory retrieval.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is how they connect ancient concepts, things embedded in myth or early philosophy, with modern scientific endeavors. They see science not just as discovering new things, but also retrieving or uncovering patterns that were perhaps known or intuited before.
Can you give some examples of what they mean?
Sure. They point to things like DNA mapping, revealing past trauma and ancestry that's literally retrieving historical and experiential memory encoded in our genes, which we discussed. Genomics revealing ancient human migrations and population bottlenecks that's retrieving deep history from our collective biological memory.
Okay.
They even suggest that AI recreating symbolic thinking is a form of synthetic memory retrieval, mirroring how our own minds evolved to process symbols. And perhaps most ambitiously, they argue that even modern physics, like field theory, sometimes mirrors ancient cosmic models found in myths, suggesting that fundamental truths about symmetry, recursion, thresholds might have been encoded in early human thought and are now being rediscovered or rearticulated through scientific inquiry.
So science isn't just discovering new things, it's also, in a way, remembering or reaccessing patterns or knowledge that was always there, perhaps in different forms. And AI plays a specific role in this remembering.
Yes, that's how they frame it. They deduce that AI often acts as a compression mirror, reflecting and distilling vast amounts of data and identifying patterns, much like how our own brains compress experience into memory and understanding.
A compression mirror.
And profoundly, they propose that physics, in its quest for fundamental laws, ultimately seeks what ancient myths, perhaps already encoded in their own symbolic language, these core concepts like symmetry, recursion, thresholds. In their symbolic framing, the processor becomes a kind of modern shrine, code becomes a hymn, and discovering truth is framed as memory returned.
Processor as shrine, code as hymn, truth as memory returned. It's a beautiful and really thought-provoking way to integrate technology, science, and maybe even ancient wisdom under this broad umbrella of memory retrieval.
It certainly makes you think differently about the purpose of science and AI.
Okay, that brings us perfectly to a more concrete, practical example of how memory and knowledge retention operate within a specific technical field. Software engineering, particularly through the practice of benchmarking.
Right, so moving from the philosophical to the very practical. Benchmarking in software engineering is essentially using an empirical standard, a defined test or set of tests, to compare different methods, techniques, tools, or system configurations. It's especially crucial for evaluating software performance and scalability.
So it's about systematically remembering what works and, maybe more importantly, how well it works compared to alternatives or past versions.
Exactly. It's a systematic way for the field, or a project team, to retain knowledge about effectiveness and efficiency. It's interesting to note, as the source material mentions, that while benchmarking is widely used in software engineering research and practice, it's not always explicitly listed as a standalone empirical standard in some formal academic guidelines, like those from ACM SIGSOFT. This perhaps highlights its practical, almost assumed importance, even if its formal definition as a standard is still evolving in some contexts.
Okay, so how does this remembering actually play out in practical software applications? Can you give us some specific examples?
Certainly. One example discussed in the sources involves a benchmark called MuBench. It's designed to evaluate the performance overhead introduced by different software monitoring frameworks, like one called Keeker.
Okay, so it measures how much the monitoring itself slows things down.
Precisely. But what's crucial here in terms of memory is that these kinds of benchmarks are often integrated into continuous integration pipelines. This allows for automatic regression benchmarking.
Regression benchmarking, meaning?
Meaning the system automatically runs the benchmark tests every time the code is updated. In essence, the system continuously remembers its past performance levels. So if a new update is introduced and suddenly performance drops significantly compared to the previous baseline, the system automatically flags this deviation, this regression. It effectively remembers when it performed better and alerts developers that something they changed broke the performance. The source mentions a specific bug caught this way in Keeker back in 2013.
So it's like the system has a memory of its own optimal state and warns you if you deviate. That's a clear example of system memory. What's another one?
Another important application mentioned is using benchmarks, like one called theodolite, to evaluate the scalability of distributed stream processing engines. Think systems like Apache Kafka Streams or Apache Flink that process massive amounts of data in real time.
Okay, how does memory play in there?
Scalability, in this context, is the ability of a system to handle an increasing workload efficiently when you give it more resources, like more servers. The benchmark tests how well these systems remember how to utilize those additional resources effectively. Does performance increase linearly as you add resources, or does it hit a bottleneck? By comparing how different systems or configurations scale under increasing load, the benchmark helps engineers understand and validate the system's memory or capability for efficient resource utilization under stress.
So these benchmarks help ensure that complex software systems don't forget how to perform efficiently or scale effectively as conditions change or the code evolves.
Exactly. And good benchmarks need specific characteristics to be effective. They need to be relevant to real-world tasks, portable across different environments, scalable themselves, and relatively simple to use and understand. There's also the concept mentioned of proto-benchmarks, which are like initial sets of tests that start a community-shared knowledge base, aiming to evolve into broader, more generalizable benchmarks over time to prevent developers from just optimizing for one narrow test.
So the whole process is collaborative memory building.
You could definitely frame it that way. This entire process of developing, sharing, and using benchmarks is a form of institutional or perhaps technological collective memory within the software engineering domain. It's about how the field systematically retains, validates, and builds upon knowledge about its tools and processes. It actively prevents the forgetting of past deficiencies or the unintentional reintroduction of old performance problems. It's the practical, nuts and bolts application of how systems, whether biological, cultural, or technological, are built to remember their own behavior and history to function better.
Wow. What an incredible journey we've taken today. We started this deep dive thinking about memory in the brain, but we've gone so far beyond that.
We really have.
We've seen memory operating in the fundamental chemistry that might have sparked life itself. We've seen it encoded in our very DNA, constantly being shaped by epigenetics. We found it acting as a vigilant guardian in our immune systems. We saw it etched onto our skin in scars and calluses, sung through the accents in our voices, and passed down through countless generations in unbelievably resilient oral traditions.
Yeah, the longevity is amazing.
We witnessed how collective memory can actively reshape historical narratives, like the shifting image of Abraham Lincoln, and how the erasure of certain stories like those of the early Black women programmers at NASA can profoundly impact our very sense of self through things like the imposter phenomenon.
A very real consequence.
And we even explored how memory manifests in the large-scale structural patterns of collapsing and renewing civilizations, and in the precise empirical evaluations of software engineering through benchmarking. It's just everywhere.
It really seems to be. And throughout this whole exploration, that profound insight from Finley keeps echoing for me. Memory as a countervailing force against entropy.
Right, the force against disorder.
Exactly. In a universe that, according to physics, constantly tends towards disorder and dissolution, memory in all these diverse forms is that incredible force that seems to transcend time. It preserves order, information, structure, and meaning. It's what allows the patterns and structures of the past to continuously influence and shape the future, creating continuity and complexity in an otherwise potentially chaotic existence.
So as we continue down this path, developing increasingly sophisticated AI systems, which Hutton and Buchwitz provocatively describe as powerful memory retrieval tools and compression mirrors, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How will this increasingly integrated web of memory internal, biological, cultural, technological continue to evolve?
What does that convergence mean?
Yeah. What new forms of human becoming, as Hutton and Buchwitz put it, might emerge from this deepening entanglement with our externalized artificial and biological memories?
And what responsibilities come with that?
Exactly. What responsibilities do we as collective humanity bear in consciously curating, understanding, and maybe even guiding this ever-expanding, multifaceted memory system, especially for those who will come after us?
It's a huge question. A lot to think about.
It certainly is. A question that definitely gives you something to remember and to ponder. Until next time on The Deep Dive, keep exploring.